Welcome to Tales from the Rabbit Hole. My guest today is Jason Colavito, a journalist who has written extensively on a topic that I'm quite interested in myself, the topic of UFOs. And he recently wrote an article called How Washington Got Hooked on Flying Saucers. A collection of well-funded UFO obsessives are using their Capitol Hill connections to launder some outre and potentially dangerous ideas, which was a fascinating read. And what I'd like to do is go over this. So, Jason, welcome to Tales from the Rabbit Hole.
Well, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Yeah, your article is very interesting. And I think it's something that's kind of lacking from the discussion that people have about this kind of current UFO, UAP story, and that's the historical context. How did you start researching this aspect of it?
Well, this is something I kind of fell into more or less by accident. For the last couple of decades, actually, I've been interested in the ancient astronaut theory and the related ideas about space aliens coming to Earth in ancient times and what have you. And because of that, I have been on the edges of the whole UFO, UAP discussion, where the ancient astronaut stuff crosses over into UFO speculation. And what happened is that some of the people who were involved with the UFO, UAP thing were also people who were involved with ancient astronaut ideas, specifically Jacques Vallée, who's famous for his book, Passport to Magonia. In there, he talks about the connections, the parallels between space alien encounters and mythology and legends from historical and medieval times. And anyway, the long and short of it is that because some of the same people cross over between the two different areas, I sort of fell into investigating the To the Stars Academy of Arts and Sciences people who were also some of the same who were involved with the ancient astronaut and other speculation. And the crossover is what led me to look into the history of the UFO flap that we're looking at right now.
Yeah, it's all very interesting. And I think something that people miss is that it's a relatively small number of people that are involved. In your article, you do actually touch on a lot of people, but in the grand scheme of things, there's not that many. And there's these common threads that have been running through these UFO stories for many, many years. And it's kind of fascinating just how long some of these people have been around and are still talking about it.
Well, it is really amazing because, the United States has 320 million people in it. And somehow the UFO issue, it comes down to the same 20 or 30 people over and over again. And it's amazing to think that the same people who were looking into UFOs in the 1960s and 70s are the same people who are still behind the current UFO flap today. And what makes that especially amazing is that all of them talk about how answers are right around the corner if only we do X, Y, and Z. And, for 50-something years, they've been doing X, Y, and Z and have produced no results. But this time, they swear, is going to be different.
Yeah, that's always something that amazes me when I look back at the history of UFOs. Right? Personally, I've just got into it recently with all the video analysis that I've been doing. But then people encourage me to read older accounts. And so I go back to these accounts from the 1950s and even the 1940s. And if you read the press coverage back then, it's remarkable how similar it is to what's going on now. It's all government. What does the government know about flying saucers? Inquiring minds want to know. It is.
Yeah, it's almost identical. I have been working on a new book that is going to in part cover some of this early UFO stuff from the 1940s and 50s. So I've also been reading a lot of that, and it's just the same thing over and over again. And even the kinds of encounters that are supposedly, the shocking new thing is exactly the same. And it's the same kinds of evidence. Well, it's pilot testimony, it's radar evidence, it's this, what, and that. And it's, the same thing over and over. And each and every time, eventually investigators go through it and find out what really happened and how people misunderstood what they were seeing and what they were interpreting the data to say at the time. And somehow, each time these flaps happen, and they happen with startling regularity usually about every 20 years, each and every time this happens, they act like there's no history behind it and that we haven't been through this before. And, it would really be beneficial to everybody to maybe have a historical perspective to look at this and say, well, the last 5 times this happened, we later discovered it was this problem, or we didn't understand this or misperceived that. And maybe that should be our starting point instead of the end point, so that we kind of circumvent the whole process of, oh my God, space aliens are invading us, before we get to the, oh, well, maybe we should check on this, this, and this before we decide the aliens are here.
Yeah, you got to learn from history. And this is, something obviously that people talk about. It's like we get a new generation. It's kind of strange, really, because we're getting new generations, these young guns of ufology, but we're also got the old guard as well, who are being involved in the same thing, and they're kind of like repeating the same thing with the new people. So let's learn from history. Let's go back to what you describe in your article, and you start in 1996 with J. Allen Hynek. And 1966. Yes, 1966. J. Allen Hynek. Now, J. Allen Hynek was an interesting character because I think at one point he was a skeptic of the whole UFO thing, and then he kind of transitioned. And you talk about him talking to Jacques Vallée. What happened there with him and Jacques Vallée?
Well, it was during the time of the Condon Committee, the big Air Force University of Colorado study that was going to determine whether there was any sort of national security threat behind UFO sightings. And both Hynek and Vallée were asked to speak with the committee. So they had flown out to Colorado to talk with them and give their evidence for the UFOs. And on the way back, Vallée and Hynek got to talking, and Hynek admitted that while he played the materialist and scientist for the public, behind the scenes, he wasn't exactly strictly according to the scientific method. He had a very strong interest in the occult. And from his earliest days, he had been really interested in this sort of immaterial psychical world beyond the material plane. In fact, he told a story later to Vallée that when he was a kid, all the other teenagers were saving up money to buy motorcycles. And he saved up $100, which in those days was a huge amount of money, so that he could buy a book of occultism and learn about...
For $100?
For $100, yes. It was Manly Hall's Secret Teachings of All Ages. It was a huge self-published book of the occult, and it was wickedly expensive back then. I mean, $100 back in the 1930s was like $1,000-something today.
Yeah, that's crazy.
And he saved up that money to buy that book, and it was a huge influence on him because he was very deeply involved with this idea that somewhere beyond the material plane there was this immaterial psychical realm that might be impugning on our reality. And while in practical terms that didn't necessarily mean that he was skewing his science to go all occult, it did mean, however, that when he started to think about what UFOs could be or might be, he did have this concept in the back of his mind that they might not be material, that they might not be nuts and bolts alien spacecraft, for example. And one of the things that he and Vallée spent many years in the late 60s and the mid 70s debating is whether they could be psychical phenomena. In other words, they were interested in whether they were closely related to poltergeists. That was the one that both Vallée and Hynek were very interested in, because they thought that poltergeist phenomena had a lot of similarities to UFOs. The people who see poltergeists and the people who see UFOs both tended to have the same reactions to them and to demonstrate the same kind of mental phenomena, so to speak.
Interesting.
Well, the idea was back then was that the people who were seeing poltergeists tended to be more sensitive, more open to things, what we would today probably term a fantasy-prone personalities. And what they saw in the connection was that poltergeists had physical manifestation in one sense, because people believed that poltergeists, being ghosts that were able to move objects, could, throw a book across a room, could cause electrical phenomena, and so on. And they were also supernatural because they existed beyond the material realm. They weren't physical objects that had mass and matter, and yet they were having a physical impact on the environment around them. So in the mind of poltergeist researchers, the poltergeists were both supernatural and had a material impact on this plane. And so what Hynek and Vallée were interested in is the question of whether the poltergeist phenomenon could be said to be parallel to or even part of the UFO phenomenon. So that UFOs were somehow or another these immaterial objects that were coming from either another plane or another dimension, popping into ours, having a physical interaction with ours while not themselves being physical, and then sort of dissolving back where they came from. So that was where they started to go. And, Hynek even gave a speech about it to a psychical research organization. So it's not like this was hidden, but he didn't really publicize it because he knew that if the media got wind that he was talking about psychic UFOs popping in from another dimension, that, he'd be labeled crazy along with everybody else who was talking about alien abductions and anal probes and what have you. And he wanted to keep his UFO research, serious, sober UFO research, right, as opposed to, the psychic aliens and the more or less crazy stuff.
So and at that time, both Vallée and Hynek were kind of doing work for like government investigations and things like that, like Project Blue Book with Hynek, and then later Vallée was working for the government in some capacity. Is that true?
To my recollection, I don't recall Jacques Vallée working directly with the federal government, but Hynek had worked with Project Blue Book until the end of Project Blue Book. But both Hynek and Vallée were in close connection with the researchers of the Stanford Research Institute, who were doing work on contract for the government with psychic phenomena. Okay. One of the people that they worked with was Hal Puthoff, and he was very much into the whole question of psychics and psychic powers. He had researched Uri Geller, the famous psychic spoonbender, and he was a strong advocate of Uri Geller and truly believed that Uri Geller had psychic powers and could bend spoons with his mind. And because they were all friends with one another, it sort of filtered in through Hynek and Vallée to Puthoff and to the people that he came to be to work with, this idea that there was a connection between UFOs and psychic phenomena. And now one of the interesting things is that the government was actually interested in this psychic research for a variety of historical reasons, none of which were very good. The long and short of it being that they thought the Soviets were using psychic spies to monitor America's nuclear arsenal and our defense industry by training psychics in Russia to use their mental projection to see what was going on inside our facilities.
And this is a real thing, isn't it? This is something that's documented, and we know that it actually happened. That they believed
it was called Project Stargate, and a whole lot of files related to it from the CIA and Defense Department were declassified a couple of decades ago. And they're all available online. You can go and look at them anytime you like, but they really did believe in this sort of thing.
The film Men Who Stare at Goats, that's kind of based on that. I mean, it's not entirely a work of fiction. It's actually kind of based on a true story.
Oh, yeah, that was all part of it. At the time, the government was into all sorts of very strange things. The U.S. Congress, for example, contacted the CIA repeatedly over the course of the 1970s and 80s and asked them to use spy satellites to find Noah's Ark.
Really?
The government has elements within the government have believed
people.
People. Sometimes small groups, usually it's individuals, but have used the power of the government to investigate all sorts of things that we would objectively consider highly unlikely.
Yeah.
So, UFOs were just one of many different things. But in the case of the psychic phenomena, not only did the government pursue this idea that psychic spies could be used to look into Russian assets, some of those psychic sessions, turned into ancient astronaut hunts. In one file that was released, a CIA handler had a remote viewer, and they went back in time 1 million years to probe Martian civilization and commune with ancient Martians. This is the federal government doing this.
Yeah. This was funded by the federal government, and someone obviously pushed for this research to happen because people believed that these things were real. Some people within the government.
Yes, you have to remember that in the middle 20th century, the CIA was into all sorts of bizarre things. So while this seems strange, it's part of a continuum with the same CIA that was strapping bombs to cats and creating exploding cigars and all of the other bizarre things that, in retrospect, pretty obviously were never going to work.
Yeah.
But, at the time, they had a much broader idea of what was plausible than I think many of us would today.
Yeah, it's fascinating, and obviously a lot of this still resonates to today, and we see this type of thing being repeated to a certain degree. And the people you mentioned, they're still around. Obviously, Jacques Vallée, I just saw him interviewed about this whole thing recently, and Hal Puthoff has been part of the whole recent stuff. I think he was doing some work with Tom DeLonge. So even though we're talking about,
he's been a major figure in that for many, many decades. Not only was he part of that remote viewing psychic stuff, but he moved on to work with Robert Bigelow, the very wealthy, eccentric hotelier who started an aerospace company to pursue his interest in the paranormal. He was deeply interested in space aliens, in life after death, and the occult, and all of that sort of thing. And Puthoff worked with him to investigate space aliens, werewolves, skinwalkers, space spooks, demons from other dimensions.
When was that approximately?
That was in the early to mid 1990s.
Early 90s, yeah. So it's still a long time ago. It's this is still history. We're talking about stuff that started in the 1960s and then 70s, 80s, 90s.
That program, that relationship formed the core of what became the Pentagon's UFO program.
Right.
And that's because Robert Bigelow was the guy who called up Harry Reid and said, more or less, that he wanted funding to go study the space ghosts and the space spooks at his Skinwalker Ranch in Utah. And Harry Reid said yes. Bigelow and his ranch had spent years with a team of scientists led by Hal Puthoff and some other people who are still the same ones looking at stuff today. But they had spent years hunting down what they thought were interdimensional portals where space aliens or space poltergeists or what have you were leaking through from the sky to another dimension. And somehow or another, they actually convinced a scientist from the Defense Intelligence Agency that this really happened and that they had found a portal to another dimension or whatever. And the DIA began to investigate. And they actually decided they were going to work with Bigelow at Skinwalker Ranch to hunt space spooks. And because of that, Bigelow was able to take that relationship and go to Harry Reid and say, hey, this is what we're doing now. Give us money so we can do this formally as part of a broader program investigating unexplained aerial phenomena. And Harry Reid and two other senators agreed to do that. And what's interesting about that is that they're retroactively casting this as a UFO program. But it wasn't a UFO program when it started. It was a program to hunt poltergeists from another dimension. And it sounds ridiculous, and it is ridiculous, but it's what they were doing.
Yeah, it's
whitewashing
quite amazing.
it now and saying, oh, well, it was always about these unexplained aerial phenomena that could be a national security threat. Except when they started, they were hunting down interdimensional beings and werewolves and skinwalkers and what have you. And we can see that in the report that Robert Bigelow's team filed during this initial program that Harry Reid had funded. And in that report, they talk about other dimensions. They talk about alien implants. They talk about whether space alien encounters cause health effects that impact human health. And they go into all of this weird and bizarre stuff. In fact, in the New Yorker article about it, one of the defense officials actually says in there, well, we knew when we read it, we can't release this. It would be a disaster. And that's because it's just so very strange. And what happens is that program gets sort of filed and filtered down into, well, we were looking at unexplained aerial phenomena. And they leave out all of the weird stuff in order to make it sound more serious and sober. In fact, Ralph Blumenthal, the New York Times reporter, who broke the story of the Pentagon UFO program in 2017, he actually admitted recently that, they purposely kind of shaped the narrative to focus on the UFO program and not all of the other weird stuff because they didn't think that New York Times readers would accept the broader, weirder part. And, that's one of those things where you have to say, if you're shaping the narrative because you don't think your readers will believe it, maybe you ought to step back and say, what the heck's going on here? We ought to be telling them they're doing this weird stuff. And we really ought to think about, hey, maybe hunting space ghosts on the taxpayer's dime needs a little bit of a rethink.
Yeah. I think this kind of shaping the narrative is something that's happened quite a lot. And one small aspect of that is Bigelow's involvement with the FAA. Which is something I just looked into a little bit recently. If you look into the guidelines the FAA, the Federal Aviation Authority, has for reporting UFOs, now they just have like a single paragraph that says, if you think it's a danger, call the local authorities, otherwise report it to a UFO collection site. And they give an example of New Fork, I think, the National UFO Reporting Council. But if you go kind of back in time on those regulations, you get Robert Bigelow's phone number, the Bigelow Aerospace Science Research Center. And if you go back even further in time on the FAA regulations, you get the phone number and the website of NIDS, the National Institute for Discovery Science, I believe.
Yep, Robert Bigelow,
which is Robert Bigelow back in the 90s, maybe the early 2000s. And this was his institute for studying the paranormal and studying UFOs and studying things like cattle mutilations. And if you go to the NIS website, which is archived, you can see that, it looks like a typical website from the 90s, and it's got this like rotating pyramid on it. And it has a reporting form for UFOs, and which, apparently at the time was the official FAA, the federal site to report UFOs. But on that same form, it has two links. One link is for reporting cattle mutilations, and the other link is for reporting entities. And you click on the entities reporting link, and it's this form about essentially reporting ghosts. And, it's things like, did the temperature change when you saw this entity, and what was going on in the air, and did you hear any strange noises? And so you've got this federal body, the FAA, with this direct link to this kind of weird pseudoscience, this ghost investigation. And it's kind of bizarre, like how did that actually happen? How did the FAA get persuaded to do this? Now, I spoke to one air traffic controller a few years ago, and he told me they were actually happy to get this phone number for Bigelow, because people used to call them all the time reporting UFOs, and they didn't know what to do with them. They saw some light in the sky, but now they had a phone number to give, so they could just pass them off. But it isn't really going anywhere. But yes, it's fascinating that the federal government has been essentially infiltrated to a small degree with these people.
Well, it's not just Robert Bigelow who did that, of course. Bigelow is the driving force behind this because of his very powerful interest, not specifically in space aliens. In fact, he recently said he's not interested in UFOs anymore, but in this occult worldview overall. And, that Bigelow is deeply involved with all of the people who are connected to every phase of the alien UFO world. When you look at the 1990s alien abduction conferences and things, the people have pictures there of themselves with Robert Bigelow because he was into the alien abduction stuff and all of that. But his influence goes far beyond just the formal infiltration of government and the perversion of America's UFO investigations toward his occult ends. What you see is that people begin to be drawn into the world that he and his team have created. And for example, as I had said before, Hal Puthoff was interested in all this psychic stuff. And it's interesting to see that in the government documents, you read that when Project Stargate, the remote viewing psychical research stuff, came to an end, and they're folding it up, one of the documents talks about the people at the Pentagon who were read into the program and who were apparently already familiar with it. And one of them is Chris Mellon. Mm-hmm. And he was intrigued by, to say the least, this Stargate research. And according to the documents, he was already deeply familiar with and well-versed in the program, the psychical research and all that stuff. And Christopher Mellon becomes one of the leading pushers of the current UFO narrative. And I don't think that's entirely a coincidence, because you see that once he leaves government, he goes into lobbying, but he revolves around this UFO world and around the people who are part of the Bigelow Puthoff psychic stuff, so that when To the Stars Academy launches, Christopher Mellon is drawn into that. And he's there with people who were part of the Bigelow team, people like Hal Puthoff. And they're all part of the same group, just under a new name. So you see the same group of people moving. They pick up and drop members occasionally over time, because after 50 years, not everyone's still around. But the same core group keeps moving through the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s, the 2010s. It's the same people with the same narrative over and over again. And whether the color they put on it is remote viewing or UFO investigations or space poltergeists, the color is just the top level, because inside of that is always this same idea that what we're really looking at isn't space aliens, it isn't a specific phenomenon, but rather it's this sort of nebulous, almost anti-scientific idea that there is this spiritual, material, immaterial, ultra-dimensional reality beyond the physical world. It's kind of that rejection of modernity almost, this rejection of materialism, of what we would consider science, but they would probably say is a false science because it's only focused on the material, but this almost Gnostic rejection of reality in favor of some sort of cosmic truth that lay beyond the physical world.
It's fascinating. They describe this themselves, or Vallée describes it as the invisible college. That term dates back quite a long time, I believe, and it's still in use now.
Yeah, it was a joking term that Vallée had used in one of his books to describe the researchers that were positioned throughout academia and the government that he felt were sympathetic to his cause, most of whom eventually became part of his orbit. You know that Jacques Vallée, he doesn't stand apart from all of this. He's been intimately involved with it the whole time, too. He was one of the members of the board of advisors to NIDS. He became closely connected to the stars. He wasn't formally part of it, but he worked with them in testing so-called metamaterials, looking for crashed alien wreckage. And even now, he just published a new book in which he claims to have found evidence that the United States government retrieved a crashed space alien flying saucer in 1945, I believe it was, before Roswell. And, that book carries right on. It's a big endorsement from Chris Mellon, saying that he thought that this was the most compelling proof yet that the government is harboring secret alien technology, says the guy who was most recently quoted in saying that, we don't know that it's aliens. Except when you make money off of it, your friends make money off of it, and you put it on the cover of a book, right?
So how does a physical craft fit into Vallée's worldview? If he thought it was interdimensional manifestations, then now we have a crashed physical craft.
Yeah, that's one of those things where there's this kind of ambiguity, mostly because a lot of the people who advocate these things haven't really thought them through for rigorous consistency. Because when it comes down to UFO speculation, mostly you keep throwing ideas at the wall until something sticks. They throw out dozens of different ideas until finally something seems partly right and then say, I told you so. But in Vallee's case, he does believe that they're both psychical and somehow material at the same time. In his book, he actually speculates that these immaterial, ultra-dimensional beings are creating these, using their psychic powers to create basically flying saucers that they then purposely drive into our dimension and crash into the Earth so that we can retrieve the technology and benefit from their glorious insights.
Really?
Yeah, that's really. It's in his book. It's called The Best Kept Secret, and he just self-published it. It was last month, I think. And it was not good. It was not a good book. But
I have not looked at it yet. But.
And like all of the UFO and ancient astronaut theorists, he doesn't actually say, this is what happened. He asks questions, and he says, could it be? And I think it might be the case that. So even if he does turn out to be wrong, he said, well, I never actually said that. I was only speculating that it might be until we found something different. So, and that's how they get away with a lot of things, It's the same in almost all those pseudo fields where you're just asking questions. Like Eric von Däniken, the famous ancient astronaut theorist from Chariots of the Gods. That was his whole line. He would get confronted time and again with, well, we did the research and we found this claim wasn't true. We found that, no, there isn't a cave filled with alien gold in Ecuador. And no, space aliens didn't really build the pyramids before Noah's flood. And every single time he said, well, I didn't actually say that. I'm just asking questions. But the thing is that readers and viewers, they don't hear you asking a question. They hear you saying, this is what I think. And they don't pay attention to the niceties of it. And, their assumption is if you're asking the question, it's because you think the answer is yes.
Yes, indeed.
You don't ask questions that you don't think have positive answers.
Yeah. I was listening to a podcast with Lou Elizondo recently, and he was asked about the Invisible College. And he also mentioned something called the Aviary, which I'd not heard of before, which apparently is this secret organization where people use bird names as code names. Are you familiar with this?
Is it like the College of Owls from Batman?
I don't know exactly what it is, but I think it's kind of like the Invisible College, but it's a way of people to talk about each other without revealing who they are talking about. And this is something Lou Elizondo talked about. I'm not making this up. It's some kind of secret.
I don't think there's anything from UFO lore that he hasn't at some point or another just asked questions about. He was recently talking about how he thinks that there's going to be this grand rebirth of civilization when disclosure shows us that the aliens are changing our ideas of philosophy and religion and what have you. And he, in another recent interview, he more or less conceded that he thinks that all of this is down to ultra-terrestrials, the interdimensional space spooks. And, at some point you have to realize that while he banks a lot on his credibility as a former Pentagon official, a lot of the words that come out of his mouth aren't his words. They're Jacques Vallée's words, they're Hal Puthoff's words, they're ideas from 1970s and 1980s ancient astronaut books and UFO books, and even by his own admission, from 1970s science fiction. He cited a sci-fi story from 1973 or 4 or whatever it was as one of the frameworks through which he tries to understand UFOs. This idea that there's a hidden civilization underneath the ocean, and they're sending UFOs to the surface as probes from this sort of invisible, hidden, secret world. Like, okay, got some evidence for that?
The way you talk about this and the way you describe it, the influence that Vallée and Puthoff and others have throughout the years, it almost seems like a very small cult with a kind of limited number of people in positions of of influence who throughout the years have been kind of trying to get this narrative across, and they've been recruiting people throughout the years. Like Elizondo, I don't know if would he have been a UFO believer before he got involved in this ATIP program. Do you think perhaps he just simply...
According to him, he was not.
No, so he became convinced, kind of like
Yes.
the mind virus of Jacques
Well,
Vallée,
yeah, basically.
and Puthoff.
I mean, I don't want to sound, I don't want to sound conspiratorial here, because it's not like there was a vast conspiracy of pod people who are kind of sucking brains dry. But what there is a network of influence.
Right.
You know, there are people who are interested in UFOs as a topic. You know, I can't say that I've never been interested in UFOs. I wouldn't be here if I hadn't been at some point. But what happens is people get interested in topics, and then they become radicalized by exposure to a particular set of ideas that they feel is powerful and prestigious. And within the UFO field, for better or for worse, Jacques Vallée's ideas are prestigious. A long, long time ago, before I really knew anything about Jacques Vallée, I had read one of his books. It was called Wonders in the Sky. And in it, he went through 1,000 years of UFO sightings and took all these ancient and medieval texts and analyzed them and presented them and said, this is the evidence for UFOs over time. And I thought, wow, this is crap. And that's because as somebody who is interested in ancient and medieval literature, I'd read a lot of the source texts. And being able to read the original languages, I had read through a lot of that material and recognized that, you know, these things aren't translated right. This doesn't say what you think it says. And in some cases, like the author literally says at the end, but it was all a dream, or this never happened. You're leaving this part out. So I had started writing about that on my blog and talked about all of the mistakes that I found in his book. And one of the things that I kept getting was emails from very angry, very outraged people who were saying, you know, Jacques Vallée is the most respected ufologist in the world, and you can't criticize him. He's one of the greats, and so on. And like, well, it's wrong. I'm not going to tell you it's right just because he's an old man who was inspiration for Close Encounters of the Third Kind. It's just wrong.
Yeah.
And when I went back and looked, those errors aren't just in that one book. He was repeating them for half of a century. The same errors over and over and over. And because of his reputation, he's a Frenchman and a philosopher, and he was a great thinker on UFOs, no one ever checked. Like for 50 years, all the way from Passport to Magonia on, no one ever thought, maybe we should look this up in the actual book he's quoting and see, does it say what he says it says? Oh, it doesn't? It's that kind of deference to authority that kind of permeates this UFO culture, where people are saying, well, the authority figure says so, and therefore it must be right. And it builds this sort of self-referential mental world where people are in this philosophical system where they believe things because other people believe them. And the other people believe them because people said that believed in them years before. And all of that sort of becomes reinforcing. And it goes around in a circle over and over. And that's why you get the same people cycling through, and you get the same ideas cycling through. The same three ideas that started in when Kenneth Arnold saw his first flying saucers in 1947 are still there today. 3 days after Kenneth Arnold saw the flying saucers, there were already three major hypotheses for what UFOs were. That they were either American or Soviet technology, that they were spacecraft from another world, or that they were supernatural entities, basically demons, and that they were heralding the end times. Right. And those are still the same three hypotheses that we're working with today. And that's ridiculous. It's been nearly 75 years, and we're still dealing with the same three things that people speculated about randomly 3 days after the UFO was first seen.
And we're still getting it having an effect on the government, essentially. You know, the federal government is doing things based on these people and these recycled ideas and the influence they've had on other people.
Well, the thing about that, though, is that the federal government gets into this not because they see a national security crisis. But right at the beginning, it's because of popular and public interest. Mm-hmm. And that filters into the government and starts to create this snowball effect where they begin investigating because the public is interested, and especially because the media are interested. And that in turn generates more media coverage, which generates more investigation. And what happens is that people within the Pentagon, especially, all the way back to the late 1940s, there's this small group within the Pentagon who think, oh yeah, well, this could actually be aliens. And that group becomes self-perpetuating and self-reinforcing, no matter how hard Pentagon leadership tries to stamp it out. And they did, for decades, try to stamp it out because they recognized that these people were acting more or less irrationally in believing this. When you go back to the early reports in the 1940s, you find that in 1947, the FBI investigated and more or less determined that they thought that the whole idea that flying saucers were alien spacecraft, they believed it almost certainly came from the work of Ray Palmer, who was a science fiction editor for one of the pulp science fiction magazines, who had begun promoting this idea that flying saucers were space alien craft at a time when most people didn't think that they were. And they concluded in one of their reports that it was more or less Ray Palmer's advocacy that created the media frenzy that these were space alien craft, which in turn influenced the public to believe it. But within a couple of years, you find people in the Pentagon who are arguing that they must be space alien craft. Now, why did they do that? It wasn't because they had evidence that these things came from another world. When you read the reports, what you find is that the people who advocated for space alien craft eliminated every other possibility that in space aliens because they didn't believe that pilots were capable of being wrong. That was because at the time, now you have to remember this was the late 1940s when all pilots were men and everyone was incredibly sexist. But they believed that if you saw UFOs, you were being hysterical. Right. And pilots couldn't be hysterical because they were super masculine he-men and couldn't have a woman's disease and be effeminate and thinking and seeing things in the sky. So if the pilots couldn't be wrong, because that would compromise national security, because it would mean that our soldiers, our sailors, our airmen weren't masculine he-men, but were in fact capable of being hysterical and irrational. If they couldn't be wrong, then flying saucers had to be from another world because they couldn't be anything else.
Yeah.
And it is it's that idea that we have to trust pilots to draw conclusions about what they see. Because for them to be wrong is to question the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, America's entire national security infrastructure that yields this kind of snowball effect of this snowballing effect of the mythology of flying saucers as alien spacecraft. And that's still what we see today. Not necessarily the masculinity hysteria thing, but still that idea that if you question pilots' conclusions about what they see, not necessarily what they saw, people see what they see, but how they interpret what they see, you're somehow questioning national security, you're questioning authority, and that's an impossibility if you want to maintain your good patriotic standing.
Yeah, it's very true. It's something I hear all the time is that, how can you not believe that this pilot has said this thing? Mm-hmm. And also that people say that if this is true, then we have this terrible problem that, we've got this issue where pilots are seeing things. They see it as some kind of disaster for national security that a pilot can't identify something, when really it's a fairly straightforward and mundane thing that pilots are sometimes not going to be able to identify things, or they will sometimes misidentify things. But I want to move on.
Worth considering. Oh no, I was just going to say real quick that something worth considering. I don't know if you've ever read a book called The Mind in the Cave by David Lewis Williams. No. It's a book about Paleolithic culture, but it goes into this idea that the mind has within it, I don't want to call them archetypes because Carl Jung kind of drove that into the occult ground, but these sort of generic forms,
right?
Things like circles and squiggles and spirals and what have you. And that these things can be auto-generated within the mind in response to ambiguous stimuli. Mm-hmm. So what happens is any human mind anywhere in the world will automatically generate or react to these shapes. But how we interpret those shapes is determined by a cultural script. So, for example, if we see a lightning bolt shape, we'll interpret that as a lightning bolt. But another culture might see that as a snake in the sky. Right. Similarly, what we find throughout time is that people see circles in the sky. Obviously common shape, but it's something that Lewis Williams talks about as one of the core archetypical shapes that are generated in altered states of consciousness and situations where there's a lot of stress or anxiety and what have you, that it can be self-generated from within the mind. But what you see when you see that circle, whether you see a chariot pulled by the horses of the sun, whether you see an alien spacecraft with windows, or what have you, is determined by the cultural script. And one of the things that we find in our culture is that because Ray Palmer had created this mythology that things seen in the sky were alien spacecraft, which he was doing to sell magazines because he was selling magazines about stories of alien invasion. Because we have that cultural script that's been reinforced for 70 some odd years now, the cultural script that we use to interpret ambiguous stimuli ends up shaping what we see into these cultural messages, even if they're not, actually there. It's not that anything is going wrong in your mind. It's not that you're hallucinating or seeing things. But when you get an ambiguous a stimulus of any kind, a light, a shape, what have you, it runs through these archetypical forms and is processed through a cultural script so that you interpret it according to what you believe you're going to interpret. Yeah. Now, I'm not saying that's the explanation for every UFO, obviously, but it does explain how there can actually be something you're seeing, but what you're interpreting and experiencing isn't necessarily what's directly in front of you.
Yeah. I think you do see that in many UFO cases as well that were solved. And especially with pilots, because pilots often get ambiguous stimuli because the things they see in the air are often small or far away or just simply lights. And one of the common ones that has happened a few times in the past is that pilots will mistake Venus for an oncoming plane. And that's not so much a cultural archetype. It's what pilots are used to seeing in the sky. Their brains have been hardwired, but programmed over time by lots of experience into interpreting things around them as flying craft, because a large part of being a pilot is avoiding other planes. Yes. Not that you're bumping into them all the time, but you have to be aware of where other planes are, and you have to identify traffic in various locations. So your brain is constantly seeking out other planes. So when you see something that's a bit ambiguous, like a Venus devoid of any context, a little light in the sky, you tend to interpret it as the type of thing that you are looking for, a flying craft. And then when it doesn't move exactly as you expect, because it is in fact a distant, far away object, you interpret that motion or that parallax or whatever, its relative motion, as being some kind of amazing acceleration or something like that. It's you kind of, your mental framework imposes order on ambiguous stimuli and makes it non-ambiguous, but not necessarily the correct non-ambiguous interpretation. So here we are with the UAP report about to drop in a few days. The Pentagon has had these programs of alien, UFO investigations and historically paranormal investigations. Do you think things are going to change in the future? Do you think the Pentagon is going to want to extricate itself from this situation?
I wish I had a good answer for that. I'd like to think that they would, but historically speaking, there have always been at least some people within the Pentagon who have been interested in occult, paranormal, and strange ideas. Obviously, the Pentagon is not a monolith, and I don't think we can expect that there'll be one totalitarian decision from the top down that we'll never speak of this again. My guess would be that, like with previous flaps, the Pentagon leadership will mostly wash their hands of it, and it'll go back to being some strange thing that happens in the background from lower level people who maintain an interest in it. I don't really know, though. A lot of it's going to depend on what Congress does.
Right.
Because if the people in Congress who have become increasingly radicalized by media coverage, and that is something to note, the radicalization you see in members of Congress on this issue isn't really due to any new developments in UFOs. It's due to the New York Times and the New Yorker putting these stories right where the Congress people are going to see them. And it's especially due to Chris Mellon and his friends lobbying them and saying, we should do something about this, while pointing to the news stories that they themselves had helped get into the newspapers and the magazines to justify it, saying, see, it's in the media, we need to do something. Well, yeah, but you put it in the media, so you're saying we need to do something because you put it there. But a lot of it's going to come down to what Congress decides to do. If, for example, the Congress people actually read the stuff that I wrote and say, hey, wait, maybe this is a little problematic and we should back off on this, then, it might fizzle out and nothing will happen. If, on the other hand, Marco Rubio or John Warner, I got the wrong senator's name, but if Mark Warner, yes, the current senator, John Warner was a former senator. Anyway, if Marco Rubio and Mark Warner say that they're going to hold hearings and want to probe the issue further, or if they do like Harry Reid did and start appropriating money for further research, then, this might drag on for months or years or what have you. It really, a lot is going to depend on how the media react to it and how Congress decides or doesn't decide to go forward after seeing the public and media reaction to the report.
Yeah, it's, I guess the invisible college isn't going anywhere. So they're going to be trying to, push their narrative going forward. But
well, on the plus side, they can't stick around forever. So unless the new generation continues to advocate with the same tenacity as the previous one, eventually the people who are ensconced in government with an interest in this subject won't be there anymore. We can't expect the same people from the 1970s to still be there in the 2020s and beyond. So a lot will depend
to the new generation.
A lot depends on how well the new generation takes up the banner, I guess. Lou Elizondo wants to be one of the leaders of it, and it's clear that he doesn't have the ability to worm into the bureaucracy the way previous generations did. They kept a lot of their strange ideas secret. They didn't talk about the weirdest stuff in public. And they certainly didn't make a spectacle of themselves most of the time while they were trying to lobby for the CIA or the DIA or what have you to spend money investigating the occult and the paranormal. They wanted to get it done and they used their power to do it, but they didn't crow about it where people would see it and think, hey, wait a second, maybe that's kind of weird that we're spending all this money to hunt psychic space ghosts.
Yeah, I wonder if maybe things are going to backfire because there's been so much publicity and so much interest in the story. And now the report will come out and it'll just be a list of unsolved UFO cases. And people are going to be asking, what's the big deal? How did we get here? And, I hope people do actually, read your article and look at the history of what's going on and see just how much strangeness and what strange beliefs underlie a lot of what's actually going on.
Well, if there's any consolation, it's that each iteration has been a little less competent and a little less powerful than the one before. When Robert Bigelow and NIDS was doing all of that, they were right there with not a massive program, but they had a funded program. They were producing reports. They had allies throughout the government and what have you. And now we're down to the Stars, which ended up breaking apart because they couldn't keep their story straight long enough to get anything substantive done. We had Tom DeLonge talking about Lemuria and psychic space ghosts and what have you on the one hand, and Mellon and Elizondo lobbying for a UFO report on the other. And now we're down to Skyfort, the newest iteration, which Elizondo is ambiguously part of. He's on their advisory board. And Skyfort, so far they seem to be completely amateurish about it. They couldn't even manage to get their rollout right. They stumbled into having Tucker Carlson accidentally reveal their existence. And then a reporter managed to find all of their secret information on their website that they didn't secure very well. So, a lot of what has happened each time, it's a little bit less organized, a little bit more amateurish with each round, as this issue kind of becomes more and more diffuse. And part of that's a good thing because, they're stumbling into success mostly because the media is helping them to do it. So if the media stops covering this like it's a national security crisis, the whole rationale for their existence goes away. But on the other hand, the fact that this is becoming more diffuse and less centered means that the belief in it is spreading through society. And the surveys that were taken about belief in these ideas, Chapman University for several years conducted a survey about American fears and beliefs in the paranormal and the occult and all of that sort of thing. And what you saw in each of those surveys is that the number of people who were reporting belief in flying saucers, in ancient astronauts, and contact with ghosts and the paranormal and all of that increased steadily through the 2010s. And, Chapman University stopped conducting that survey, so we don't have recent data from the last year or two. But the trend lines were pretty clear, and they very clearly follow media interest in the subject. Yeah. When cable TV was doing a bunch of documentaries about ancient astronauts and ancient aliens, you saw belief in that rise. Now, at any one given time, there aren't that many people watching a cable TV show about it. There weren't that many people watching a cable TV show from the Luis Elizondo either. But what you see is that the legitimization process, that these things are being talked about in the media, helps create this impression that there's something serious and substantive behind it, even when it's just a bunch of tall tales and ambiguous data that are getting thrown out with a bunch of 1940s sci-fi theories. But because the New York Times says this is important, because the New Yorker says this is important, because you can see documentaries about it on the History Channel, it gets that air of importance that becomes self-referential and self-perpetuating. People come to believe that even if they just lightly think, well, maybe there's something to it, they come to that conclusion because of the agenda-setting function of the media. The media say this is happening and this is important. Therefore, people at least provisionally accept, okay, this is at least as credible as whatever is happening on the news. And so while it's great that the UFO advocates are not nearly as politically powerful as they had been in the past, in the sense of being able to direct the functions of government and bend the Pentagon to their will, it's not so good that the reason for that is because the ideas that they're advocating aren't limited to just one small segment of the population now, but are widely believed by anywhere from a third to half of Americans. Yeah. And that's not a good thing.
Yeah, it's kind of broken out from the, obviously it's always been a thing, the UFO belief, but the legitimization of it is what is kind of spreading now. People are saying there is definitely something to it because I saw it in the New York Times. My hope here is that there will kind of be a second wave of journalism in this after the report is released, and we kind of get a clearer picture of what's actually been going on, and that people will... some more serious journalists, including hopefully the New York Times, will actually look into the story with a bit more of a critical eye and a bit better perspective.
The New York Times used as their UFO reporter from 2017 to 2020, Leslie Kean. And where she ended up. She's not going to be reporting on UFOs for the New York Times anytime soon because she is getting a movie made of her life story by HBO Max. Right. And she's joined Robert Bigelow at the Bigelow Institute for Consciousness Studies to study ghosts and the paranormal and the afterlife.
Yes, things are coming full circle. It's quite remarkable. Just, it does revolve around a very small number of people and very much around Robert Bigelow. So it's, I think a lot of people don't even realize this. And a lot of people who have been following the story haven't even heard of Bigelow and
Well, they
the
don't,
influence that he's
because
had.
for the most part, the media have kept him out. I
Yeah.
mean, when the New York Times, when Blumenthal and Keene did that story, the initial story, they gave Bigelow a very, very narrow part of that story. And to my mind, purposely limited discussion of his influence and of course the strange ideas that he advocated, because like Ralph Blumenthal said, New York Times readers wouldn't have accepted it. And it's been a dangerous concept in journalism, this idea that we should shape stories around what audiences expect to hear and not what they need to hear. Now, to their credit, 60 Minutes did do a story with Robert Bigelow once, and then they went back and did that UFO story with Louis Elizondo and Chris Mellon, and never once mentioned their strange ideas about ultra-terrestrials or space spooks. Never once talked about how Robert Bigelow, essentially created this program to hunt for ghosts and werewolves and what have you on his Utah ranch. So there is this huge failure in journalism where the journalists are trying to make their stories sound serious by purposely cutting out the stuff that they should be reporting, which is, even if you do believe that there is a serious issue to investigate, the people who are doing it are not necessarily the ones you'd want to be doing it because they have certain biases and very strange ideas that are coloring the shape of the results they're reporting.
Yeah, well, I certainly hope that more journalists do cover that aspect of it, and it's something that I've been increasingly bringing up when people talk to me about this, because I think it's a very important part of understanding what's been going on in the past and what's going on now with the report, and understanding what's going to happen over the next year or two as things kind of shake out. So it's going to be quite interesting. What do you think is going to happen when the report drops?
What do I think?
Yeah.
I think that there will be a bunch of stories in the news, and most of them will probably say something along the lines of the report was ambiguous, didn't say very much, and that the usual UFO suspects are very disappointed, but are calling for further investigation, and then conveniently link to whatever products and services they're offering to help investigate.
All right. Well, we'll see. We'll see. Hopefully it will come out in a few days. Well, I want to thank you very much for this really interesting conversation. And yeah, it's an ongoing story, and maybe we can talk again sometime after the report and see how things actually do shake out in the future.
Well, certainly. It was great speaking with you.
You too. You have a good day, Jason. Thank you very much.
Yeah.